would be the book that I was thinking of writing. So, when you're an academic and you spend a long time reading and writing, there's a sense of anxiety. Oh my God. Now, if he says it all, then I better have a different story. But also a sense of excitement about what he might say and what the story of the book might be. So then I went into the book, and the first thing that I realized is that the book is wrongly titled. Whatever else it is, it's not about understanding the founding fathers or the founding of the Republic. It's a very interesting political history, and it's a narrow argument, and I recommend it highly. And suggest that all of you take the opportunity to read it. But the one thing you don't get is that you don't get the founding of the Constitution or the Republic. So you're going to read it for other reasons. Now, I could do one of two things at this stage, which is to just say that, okay, let me just say what I think, or let me stick with the book. But because I promised that I'll stick with the book, let me try and work through what I think is interesting about this book and try and respond to some of its central themes. So, so if it's not aptly titled, then what is it about? It's about a response to two figures. One is a curious figure, Swami Sachidanand, who I frankly, till I read this book, had no idea who he was. He happens to be a Gujarati saint-like figure of some influence and some controversy. But Rajmohan Gandhi thinks he's important because at least in the Gujarati literary traditions and spiritual traditions, he seems to represent something of a vein of thinking. And I have a sense that he picks Sachidanand for another reason, which I'll say something about in the conclusion. The second person he wants to respond to is Perry Anderson. And Perry Anderson wrote this important piece called An Indian Ideology a few years ago. And what he argues there, and I'm going to use Anderson's Indian ideology as the main foil for the book, because I think Swami Sachidanand says some interesting things, but really doesn't make a sustained argument. So it's useful to use Anderson as the frame. And Anderson, what is Anderson's story? Anderson is interested in the founding of the Indian Republic, in a sense, India's political history at the time of independence. And Anderson is primarily interested in a takedown of Gandhi, Nehru, to some extent Patel, but Gandhi and Nehru in that order. And he feels that the story of India has been told through the lens of these two figures wrongly. Not that they were not politically influential, but that they were not the most important figures, at least in a history of ideas. He's not contesting that Gandhi and Nehru were politically influential or held significant offices. He doesn't contest that. He just says that, at least in the matter of ideas, they were the less important. And what they stood for was what the Indian nation shouldn't stand for, is the argument he makes. What does he supply in return? He suggests that we must look at three figures much more carefully: Ambedkar, Bose and Jinnah. And he actually invites us to imagine the counterfactual, that if these three figures were sort of in charge, it's a counterfactual. We can't imagine it easily. But if we were to imagine these three figures at the helm of political affairs, that we'd see a very different India. And what kind of India might that be? Is what Perry Anderson promises. Anderson doesn't deliver on that promise, but he suggests he's going to write a long book or something like that. So maybe in 2 or 3 years we'll know what that other India might have looked like, at least according to Anderson. So that's Anderson's argument and his invitation. He says, come, let's think about what India might have been with these other figures. So I'm not going to take on the burden of arguing against Anderson in full. If I had to argue against Anderson, I'd have to say he's wrong about Gandhi and Nehru, and that's a big other project. I know we're here to think about Ambedkar. So I'm going to actually focus on Ambedkar's place in Anderson's story and in Rajmohan Gandhi's story. And in Rajmohan Gandhi's story, he picks on two historical episodes of significance that we can reflect upon. The first is the Pune Pact, and this is something that for better or for worse, we have some popular sense of what the Pune Pact is about, and I'll say a little more. And the second is about partition and communalism. So on both these counts, Anderson argues that Gandhi and Nehru had it wrong, and that Ambedkar and probably Jinnah had it right. And that if Ambedkar and Jinnah, in fact, were to come together, that's the counterfactual, we would have a far more interesting and much more alluring nation. We would have built a better nation in some sense. So let's start with the Pune Pact. There's an interesting story here. It's worth unpacking the way that Rajmohan Gandhi attacks the Anderson position. So the whole story on the Pune Pact is whether it represents coercion on Gandhi's part to force Ambedkar to the position of giving up separate electorates. So that's what the real debate was about. And in Indian political thought, there have been two strains. Some have argued, using Ambedkar's words even, that it was an act of coercion. The fast was coercion. And the second strain has suggested that it was more politically contingent than that, more complicated. We should understand fasting and the strategies of fasting and Gandhi's politics in a more sophisticated way. Anderson clearly indicts Gandhi as engaging in a politics of coercion and illiberal politics. It's not what Gandhi professes. And Anderson tries to show clearly that Ambedkar got the raw end of that stick. So Rajmohan Gandhi takes issue with that. And he does two interesting things in the book. And I think, given the context of Arundhati Roy's polemic, I'll call it, on the Gandhi-Ambedkar relationship, this is an important clarification that Rajmohan Gandhi makes. Rajmohan Gandhi points out something very interesting, which I think is just useful as a matter of intellectual history, is that Arundhati Roy follows Anderson. And he shows that so clearly that it's something that I hadn't noticed, and it's quite useful and interesting to think about as to why Anderson's narrative about the Pune Pact might be so attractive to Arundhati Roy, or that style of thinking. So the first thing that he shows is that the entire marshalling of Ambedkar's comments about what the Congress and Gandhi have done to the Dalits or to the scheduled castes, or Ambedkar's disavowal of the Constitution, which is what Arundhati Roy uses and Anderson uses, to say that this entire project of building a constitution and settling the Pune Pact was something that Ambedkar fundamentally disagreed with. And the only reason he went along was because he thought it. We probably thought as a political matter or as a in the mood of the times, he had no option. In other words, the way it's put colloquially, he didn't want Gandhi's death on his hands. So that's the way the position is captured. And what Rajmohan Gandhi does very well is to show that the Ambedkar's rejection of the Pune Pact and Ambedkar's rejection of the Constitution is not in 1932. It is way down the line in 1954 and 1957, and that the entire literature about the political contest between Gandhi and Ambedkar has been staged as a contemporaneous exchange. It is not a contemporaneous exchange. It's separated by 17 years or more of history, significant years, because in those in-between years, Gandhi, Ambedkar, Nehru and others are working together on common political projects. So the way the debate is set up in much new writing about this is to suggest that Gandhi fasted, Ambedkar capitulated, and then he came out of the room and he said that Gandhi sold us short. That's not how it happened. How it happened was that at that point in time, Ambedkar made guarded but careful endorsements of the position as being a reasonable position that one can work with. As things went along, he clearly soured on the position that the Pune Pact represented. And what Rajmohan Gandhi does well for us is to show that paying attention to that chronology brings context to the relationship between these two actors. And I think that's interesting and important. The second thing that he sets out quite clearly is that in Gandhi's self-understanding, and I say this because this is Gandhi's words, in Gandhi's understanding of what the Pune Pact was about, why fast? And Gandhi sets out three reasons why fast along with the 1932 negotiations. The first, he says, is to move caste Hindus. So the reason for the fast, or the target of the fast for Gandhi, is not Ambedkar. It's caste Hindus to resign from their position of a sort of a maximalist, confrontational position on the question of temple entry. And he captures that even in that period, the 1932, just before and after that fasting period, there is a change in the way various Hindu community leaders react to the question of temple entry and the integration of Dalits. So his first target is caste Hindus. The second point he tries to make is that fasting is about supplementing reason. That you don't fast and then provide no reasons for your positions. He says you put out positions, you make arguments, you engage in deliberation, but the reason that you fast, then you might say, why do you fast? You just stop with reasoned deliberation. What Gandhi suggests is that for 20 years, nothing has moved on the Dalit question. So if we need to overcome the inertia on the caste question, we need to move the system. And the act of fasting is not one to substitute reasoned deliberation, but one to overcome inertia, to push institutions and to push communities to act. This kind of account of the Pune Pact, I think, to be fair to Rajmohan Gandhi's account, it's far more historically accurate. He marshals the facts and the material way better than anything that you will find in either Arundhati Roy's argument or in Anderson's argument. But I suspect there's more there, which is that if we try to understand history seriously, we have to take the idea that people are acting with complex motivations, and they have different views of the world. And the idea that you take a sort of post hoc view after the event has happened, you just stand back and castigate one or the other person as acting in bad faith is a slightly uncomplicated view of how you think about historical figures. And in this count too, I think Rajmohan Gandhi gets it right. But I suspect that the story about the Pune Pact has got to also take into account the idea that Ambedkar is far more institutionally creative in the design of political and legal and constitutional institutions than Gandhi ever was. Gandhi shows a great degree of political sagacity and sort of being nimble in political position, but shows is very stodgy about institutional design and how do you bring people together by creating new institutional frameworks. And my own sense, and this Rajmohan Gandhi doesn't say, is that we've got to come to terms with the idea that the deification of Gandhi doesn't represent the fact that he has a huge failing in his understanding of institutions. It's not a character, personality failing, but it's one person doesn't do everything. And in this case, clearly he's not doing the hard work of trying to imagine new institutions that might resolve very complex historical problems. And his stodginess about that is what results in the strong confrontation that is the Pune Pact. So on the first count, I would tend to agree with Rajmohan Gandhi's account that the Pune Pact must not be cast needlessly as this, that the strategy of fasting was just a strategy of politics by other means, and that we must take a more complex view of politics. I'm going to say something about this a little bit at the end of the session, if you travel with me along this line. The second episode that he picks up where Ambedkar figures significantly, and I'm not suggesting these are the only two reasons we should be looking at Ambedkar or his history. I'm just using Rajmohan Gandhi's book as scaffolding to think about these questions, is about Pakistan and partition. And here it's altogether interesting with great contemporary relevance. Anderson's story is simply that it's Gandhi's politics and Nehru and to a certain extent Patel's politics that bring the subcontinent to partition. Left to Jinnah and Ambedkar and Bose, surprisingly. I don't know the Bose material very well, but Anderson seems to think Bose might also have contributed to a subcontinent that was not partitioned. So Anderson makes a clear argument here that partition and the problems associated with it were the creation of a troika, or maybe 4 people. And if these 3 people were far more important and relevant in that period of India's political history, we would not have had partition. And once again, what's striking about Anderson's story is that Anderson doesn't bother to cite Ambedkar and doesn't bother to work through what Ambedkar might think about, not think as much as has said about the question of communalism and partition. And what's striking here is that for almost 20 odd years, 2 decades, Ambedkar is working with Jinnah on the same side of the table with respect to political institutions and conferences and elsewhere that protect the interests of Muslims on the one hand and backward classes on the other. That's what they were called at that point in our political history. And to that extent, Jinnah and Ambedkar travel together. They are on the same side of the question of how do you accommodate a religious minority, and in this case, what he sees as a community that's been marginalized for a long period of time. So, what Anderson and Arundhati Roy at other points take from that is the idea that Jinnah and Ambedkar somehow, they're of one mind, and Ambedkar would endorse Jinnah's leadership of the Congress and of the nation, and so on. The argument is more colorful than that, and I'll leave you to read the book and pick up the details. But what's striking in this exchange is that Ambedkar has actually expressed concrete views on the question of Pakistan and the question of partition. Ambedkar is very amenable to the idea that we can design a consociational federal system, which is a non-territorial federal system. And I don't want to get too much into the technicalities of it, but simply put, he's very open to the idea that the Muslim community can elect its own leadership, and that we can create a republic where the different communities, in this case the backward classes, the mainstream Hindus and the Muslim community, can elect their own leadership, and this elected leadership can be kind of wound up together into a political arrangement where they hold effective vetoes against each other. At a later point in political history, this gets called the idea of consociationalism. We have other countries that demonstrate this, and in some ways Ambedkar was way ahead of his time in suggesting that the best solution to the communal and the caste problem was a consociational one. But at a later point, when Jinnah pushes the idea of Pakistan, Ambedkar has a very sharp attack on the idea of Pakistan. And he says 2 things, and I'll refer to these 2, both of which are quite interesting. He says, what is Jinnah's objection to a Hindu India? Is it an objection of conscience? He calls this the conscientious objection. Or is this a political objection? So, the way he uses these terms is slightly different from how you might understand it normally, so I'll try and explain. The conscientious objection is simply that Hindus believe in another God. That is, that they are led by another conscience. And he says if it's a conscientious objection of this sort, this is not a very compelling political reason for partition. That is that we may believe in so many different, in Ambedkar's scheme of things, religious faith and belief is not terribly important till a later point in his political imagination, say 1956-57. At this point in time, your religious faith and belief is not the driving basis for political association. So the first thing he says is that this kind of conscientious objection, the idea that we should build nations around religion or religious faith and belief is an obnoxious one. If this is what Jinnah represents, I reject it. But if his objection is to a Hindu Rashtra which is opposed to the non-democratic nature of Hindu political action, I'm with him. So he tries to make this subtle distinction. He says, if it's a political objection of this sort, why does he think that only Muslims may suffer from this problem? Because the backward classes also suffer from this problem. They suffer from the non-democratic character of Hindu society. If this is his objection, then I join him. Then I think that we should all join hands and create a different kind of nation. But that position and the way the book unravels is, he says, this is not what Jinnah stands for. And this is the problem with the idea of Pakistan. And of course, in the same book, he writes uncomfortable words for the current political establishment, because he castigates the idea of a Hindu Rashtra. He says, because if the project of the Congress is to build a Hindu Rashtra, which embodies the non-democratic nature of the Hindu community, then this would be a disaster. And we should never let the Hindu Rashtra happen. Right? And he says it, I'm almost not paraphrasing, I'm quoting, because he says it in these many words. He says that the idea of a Hindu Rashtra would be an absolute disaster. So, the point that Anderson and Arundhati Roy, among others, try to make, that somehow Ambedkar and Jinnah were all of the same mind, and they were all driving in a similar political carriage, and that if history had conspired differently, we would, and they were at the at eminent positions in Indian political institutions, we would be a altogether better country. This doesn't even seem to be clearly so, even at the level of ideas. Forget even about imagining a different counterfactual universe. So, all in all, I'm suggesting that the two issues, the historical episodes that Rajmohan Gandhi picks up about the relationship between Ambedkar, Jinnah, and Gandhi and Nehru on the other hand, he by and large gets right. And which is why I want to get back to his framing. And he frames the book around the objections of the obscure Swami Sachidanand. I might be totally wrong, he might not be obscure at all, he might be the most important political figure, and given that religious Swamis are increasingly our national conscience, who knows, this might be another figure like that. So it might just be that Rajmohan Gandhi is ahead of time. But I think he's hitting at something else. What he's getting at is that there is a curious confluence of left-wing academic criticism and right-wing mobilization on historical figures. And this is something that's puzzled me. And in the work that I'm doing on the Constitution, I think we're in a critical juncture of how we understand our history and the place of the Constitution. Because isn't it strange that the BJP might think that Ambedkar, Bose, not Jinnah, Jinnah is too inconvenient, but Ambedkar and Bose might have represented the better part of our pre-independence political heritage, to the exclusion of Nehru and Gandhi. How is it that as an intellectual matter and as a political project, the academic left, I don't want to say the political left, because I don't think the political left has jumped onto this, the same position, but the academic left and the Hindu right seem to take the same view about our historical inheritance. And I think this is the most interesting thing. And just to be clear, Rajiv Gandhi's book doesn't say this at all. I'm just taking the way he sets up the argument. And I think that this unpacking this curious confluence in our time is very, very important to decipher and design what this country might look like in the 21st century. So let me stop. Question.
So you said you don't find the title of the book appropriate, and you said you suggest, not suggest, but what according to you is the appropriate title?
I think the appropriate title is that it's a response to Anderson and Swami Sachidanand. But I guess that wouldn't sell the book. And I think marketing teams are, I don't know, very, very smart.
I don't know if I can frame it the right way, but
Go on.
you mentioned that Gandhi did not understand institutional design as well as Ambedkar did. But when Gandhi rejected the Pune Pact, don't you think Gandhi actually saw the institutional failings of the Pune Pact better than what Ambedkar did, and that is why he rejected it? And so much that creating separate electorates actually makes one community vote for only a particular member of that community. So the community doesn't get together, society doesn't get together. So do you think Gandhi actually understood that?
In the literature on Gandhi, there's a significant cleavage in the way Gandhi is read. There are those who will stay close to what Gandhi has said and written, and there are those who will impute a clairvoyance to Gandhi, as if Gandhi knew everything. And there is a culture of deification, which somehow, when we, out of good faith, we say he knew everything and did everything wonderfully, and when we impute bad faith, we say the same. He knew everything. He was just being strategic. That he was just a canny operator in his mobilization of symbols, and my inclination is not to be is to stay close to the text. In Gandhi's accounts of the Pune Pact, that's after the Pune Pact. I don't know when you said Gandhi rejects the Pune Pact. I don't know what you mean. I think if you mean his rejection of Ambedkar's proposal of separate electorates, he clearly thought that the nation should be built on some other identity. He never engaged in any detailed argument about why separate electorates, as a matter of design, wouldn't work. There's no record of that. So you do not get the institutional detail in Gandhi's work. So now you can say, no, the man is very smart and he doesn't write those things, but he's thinking those things. And I don't go that line. I mean, maybe there are people who know Gandhi psychologically and psychoanalytically very well, but I shudder to go down that line. I'd rather go down what I see, and what I see is no evidence of his consideration of what should be electoral design. He has a strong objection because he thinks, like many in the nationalist movement, that these are strategies of division. So we know that, and I think we should take it for what that is. That's what he says. Is it a devious design to ensure that the backward classes will never get constituencies where they will be in political majorities? I don't push in that direction. But Ambedkar, on the other hand, has very clear institutional imagination. He writes about it. he talks about Switzerland. He talks about other arrangements in other parts of the world. He's there. He's right up there. He knows what he's talking about. He can see that institutions like this exist, and he can see that this could work in India. In his response to Pakistan, the proposal for Pakistan, he does the same thing. So I would stick to the idea that in the corpus of Ambedkar's work, we get a clear institutional imagination. I'd go as far as to say that Ambedkar's institutional imagination is far superior to Nehru or Gandhi or Patel in the evidence in their collected works. So here we have somebody here who has a grasp of the grammar of political institutions and constitutions, who at that point in our history we don't have anyone else. At least at the same. I mean, we have two other people, I must say, in the Constituent Assembly, but I don't want to drag you into. There are at least two other people who show the same level of acuity and conceptual understanding, but they're not the people that talked about in this book.
I'm not surprised that the institutional design question doesn't feature in Gandhi's writing or advocated thought, so much as I would take a step back and think that Gandhi is at this point deeply skeptical about modern institutions, and Ambedkar is deeply modernist. So therefore modern institutions and their design preoccupy him deeply in the way that Gandhi is still working through the labyrinth of how to get away from modernity, where the whole globe is going the modern way. So that would be...
Yeah, I would completely agree. And which is why that if today we have to ask ourselves, what do we owe this set of institutional arrangements to, and the particular detail of how the Constitution was made, arrived at, we have to really talk about not Gandhi and Nehru, which is the mistake of Anderson and the mistake of these projects of criticism, because the partnership is Ambedkar and Nehru. That is the partnership that one needs to explain. It's not Gandhi-Nehru collaborations or Gandhi-Ambedkar antagonisms that best explain the institutional conditions that that exist today. We really need to explain why Ambedkar and Nehru are able to work together. Not Patel either, because Patel also doesn't. Patel demonstrates something of the grammar of governance, but very little about the grammar of institutions. And it's Nehru and Ambedkar that we have the best evidence of in this respect. I agree.
Thanks, Sudhir, especially for the Rajmohan Gandhi review, which I think some of us are certainly persuaded that we should go and read it. My question is about your book, right? And sort of I'm curious about your book project. So you just said that Ambedkar had an institutional vision, and I think your response to R3 sort of explains that a bit more. But in the spirit of not deifying, and today every political party in this country, this week, has been trying to deify Ambedkar, right? So in the sense of critical engagement, I want to ask you, even within that sophisticated institutional vision, what are things that we may want to be critical of in choices that not just Ambedkar but the other founders made? And I'll just give you a couple of suggestions and maybe ask you to speak about one. So one is the question of decentralization. Right? So we know very well why Gandhi wanted a village-based system, and Ambedkar had a problem with that because of his experience with villages. But when you're making a constitution and you're thinking forward, and today when we think of this vast country and this idea, which was still a vast country and still had 300 million people in 1950, the idea that you could run it from Delhi, it doesn't have to be with hindsight. Even at that time, even if you don't subscribe to the Gandhian idea of Hind Swaraj, you don't have to be anti-state. You're very much an institutional state person, but your opposition to the panchayat leads you to the opposition to the idea of municipalities and local government generally. Right? So even the 73rd and the 74th Amendment, there is political decentralization, to use Rani Malan's term, but because there's no administrative decentralization and no financial decentralization, we're still struggling to work that out. Right? So one suggestion. So should we, and do we know more about Ambedkar? Why was he against the idea of local self-government and not just the village thing, the idealized Gandhian village? That one can understand. But why is he not thinking about the problems of trying to do this in a very centralized setup? The second is a question which Ambedkar obviously grappled with himself. So Nirja Jayal's book very nicely sort of brings out, and she says this is a puzzle. Because Ambedkar had a commitment to social rights all along. But then, as the chairperson of the drafting committee, at some stage, maybe he sees there's too much opposition, he puts them in the directive principles. After initially maintaining they have to be fundamental rights, but then pushes them over to the other side. Right? So these are two suggestions, but I'm sure you've thought about it much more. And perhaps you could respond, or perhaps you could add to other issues in evaluating Ambedkar as a constitution maker.
So,
what should we say?
So I think that the problem of deification is a real one. And you can tell with the 125th anniversary celebrations, if we have to go by what our political leaders choose to do, no one will survive state deification. Then Ambedkar will become a figure on which we can not really think about critically, and that would be a loss, because Ambedkar was the first to recognize that deification, whether that be even in political ritual, he was one of those who objected to the political rituals of prostration and the political rituals of garlanding and all these obeisances that political cultures in India had developed even in the 1940s. And he was very strong and vehement about that, not only about Gandhi's deification, but about deification in political culture generally. So I think that we should guard against that, and we should not ever lapse into the idea that all things Ambedkar and all things in the Constitution are somehow above reproach. But let's go back to that question of the question of federalism and the strong central government and strong local government. The political contingencies and motivations of the time were very different. And let me try and capture it in a very short sort of way. So long as India could have been a consociational political arrangement where the Hindus, the Muslims and the backward classes would elect their own leaders, both Jinnah and Ambedkar pushed for a strongly federal India. They wanted a federal India, just decentralize everything. Give it to the provinces, but be clear that the provinces will operate through the language of separate electorates. The moment that idea goes away, Ambedkar pivots. He says if the political majorities are going to be Hindu majorities, then there is no way that the political power can be decentralized to the states. It's interesting who he looks to for motivation. He looks at Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. He says that if we go back and give the states the power to decide the fate of the scheduled of the backward classes or the minorities, then we will be locked into a civil war kind of scenario, and we will need an Abraham Lincoln to come along to crush the states that refuse to end slavery and segregation. So his motivation, sort of his constitutional imagination, is not about the. When we talk the language of decentralization today, we have an idea that this is the most effective government. His embrace of the state, modern state, positive as it is not enthusiastic to the extent that he believes that the modern state is a utopian creation that will do good to its people at all times. He is clear that if we give the powers to the states, the backward classes will be left behind, and for another 100, 200 years. Hence the federal government. And that is the sort of the nexus around which Nehru and Ambedkar, the coalition between Nehru and Ambedkar gets built. Because Nehru thinks that the strong federal state is important, the strong unitary state is important for other projects, other political projects. His political project is not necessarily just the protection of minorities and the backward classes. It's the idea of a developmental state. And for Nehru, the unitary state is really important. So they come together on the question of unitary federal design for very different political motivations. Right? So that's the way I would cast his relationship. And of course he has a deep vehemence about panchayats and villages, because he goes back to the fact that villages are organized currently along conservative and oppressive lines, and says there's no future there, so let's try and do something different. So that's the first point. On a second point about directive principles, the directive principle story is so complicated. The history it's difficult to unpack. But the simple version that I would go with, and I've looked at that data very carefully as to what were the debates like, what were the steps in that debate. Clearly, whatever happened with directive principles happened outside the House. It happened outside the House. It happened outside of the drafting committees, because the minutes of the drafting committees and the minutes of the House do not capture why, when you have a commitment to social rights from 1907, why suddenly in 1949 you make them directive principles. So it clearly, for me, using Yun Elster's classification of bargaining and arguing, this was a bargain. It was not a product of some rational, deliberative, it's better to call these rights. No, there was something of a political bargain struck, and then there was the most that could be made of it, because he stood up to defend it. As the chairperson of the drafting committee, he stands up to defend the second draft constitution, and which has all these rights as directive principles. So clearly there was some recalibration, which is best explained by some politics that we don't know. Not even in the biographies of the key actors. No one talks about why that shift happened. That's the best account that we have. But coming back to your question of deification and the Constitution, I think my approach to thinking about that period is to give the best account that we can give of that period. It is not to defend those choices as being necessarily the best choices for an independent India. We made lots of choices in the Constitution. Some of them were interesting, some of them have clearly not worked. And there is no reason, the deification of Ambedkar, and Arun Shourie has this another polemical book called Worshipping False Gods, and I don't know if any of you have had the chance to take a look at it. There's a lot there that one should and could respond to vigorously, but there's one thing that one would have to say he captures effectively, which is the idea that constitution making is about political settlement by groups, no individual. The idea that if we change something in today's constitution, it's a rejection of Ambedkar in some way, and this is a language that's mobilized. If we change anything in the constitution, this is somehow an insult to Ambedkar or to the framers. It's a dangerous language. Ambedkar himself doesn't embrace it. He's very amenable to the idea that the constitution should be changed every now and then as we find out how this is worked. And so we should not lapse into a better understanding of Ambedkar. To my mind, Arun, is critical because of nationalist historiography that has ignored his contribution. So that needs to change. But I don't think that leads us to the idea of deification.
Hello, sir. I was just curious, how do you look down upon the grammar of anarchist speech that is very famous? And when Ambedkar criticized all the other modes of protest like Satyagraha and all, that they are not required in the modern state. And when you see today's state exactly with what is happening in Hyderabad University or in JNU, that probably the institutions that were supposed to protect the interests of these people, when they are not working, like, do you still see the significance of that speech, and do you still see that whether the vision, the trust that Ambedkar had in those institutions is worth it in the current context?
Big question. Ambedkar's objection to forms of protest was his attempt to distinguish between the place of political action in colonial India and the place of political action in post-independence India. And his point was about the legitimacy of regime He says that a post-constitutional regime that is democratically elected in India enjoys a legitimacy that is completely different, categorically different from a pre-1947 regime. At no point does Ambedkar take the position that in a legitimate political regime, all its actions, all its laws are beyond criticism or reproach. At no point. In fact, in his own political practice, and you look at the debates around the Hindu Code Bill and what happens after that, his position is very clear. You know, he's a deep institutionalist of the sort that we don't see in current politics. Because look at his reaction to the Hindu Code Bill. He says it that if Nehru cannot carry the cabinet on this and parliament on this question, I quit. The reason I quit is because I then have the freedom to protest. Because this is not to say that now Nehru is illegitimate ruler and he must be deposed. No, but Nehru and the Congress and its position on the reform of Hindu law is wrong. So he's a sort of deep institutionalist of the sort we don't see now, and we don't. It's very difficult for us to understand in our current political climate why anybody would resign. So what? One of your bills don't get passed. It seems, at least in our current political culture, that's a minor loss. There's a lot more that one can do inside government and whatever that means. But Ambedkar's position is that. So I don't think. So if you ask me to imagine the counterfactual, when would Ambedkar be proud of our current institutions? And if you mean the University of Hyderabad, no, I don't think so. I don't think he would be. His idea of the place of political protest and the nature of legitimacy of institutions is complicated enough to account for the fact that if institutions, legitimate institutions, make wrong decisions, we should protest. So I don't see him falling in that trap at all. He would be entirely comfortable with the idea that people should agitate. It's a very important part of a democratic culture.
So while studying Ambedkar and also Gandhi, I mean, I haven't done much, but then whatever I have, when you observe that, there are, I mean, also continuing from the point that there should be local and not centralized government, but local centers of government, right? So the thing is that, don't you, I'm guessing that why there is no mention of Ambedkar for such a long time is because there are no very strong foundations of Ambedkarite movement at the local levels as compared to Gandhi. And do you think that is the reason why? Because I think there are two aspects of political strategy, right? There is the content, and then also how you convince people into following you. And I think Gandhi did a lot of that, focused on content, but more other people have written on what he believes rather than he himself formulating his content.
I think, sorry to jump in. Have you finished? Yeah. No, I think if you said that Gandhian politics was alive today, Gandhis would be very happy. Most contemporary accounts of Indian politics would suggest that a Gandhian strategy or a conceptual vocabulary of politics is long gone. So Gandhi is not quite there. I'm struck by. So I guess part of your question was why isn't there a mass Ambedkarite politics? And that's a very good question, and I think that various scholars have tried to understand it and explain it. Christophe Jaffrelot's work on this is very interesting. Eleanor Elliot's, and Gail Ombit have very insightful analysis of why Ambedkarite politics doesn't take hold, and what are the constraints, both class, caste, the nature of caste coalitions, the nature of whether there's a scheduled caste political identity that is pan-Indian, and there are all these constraints, and you have to go back to 47 and try and imagine this man trying to win elections at that time. So my sense is that the constraints on a national Ambedkarite politics are several structural constraints, which are not about defects of thought, but they're about the conditions, the social and political conditions and cultural conditions that make such politics possible. So, but I want to close with something else. There must be a reason why Ambedkar Periyar societies in colleges generate such animus, at least in this political establishment. You may be right. These are small groups of students who think they're doing something interesting, and maybe they are, and maybe it will become a really big thing. But you might want to really ask why Ambedkar Periyar societies pose such a strong challenge to our contemporary ways of thinking about politics. And I think there's something there. And so maybe the historical period or the historical arc that we must judge ideas is still to close.
When we're talking about Ambedkar and Gandhi, if in case the disparities in their thought and the kind of thought process they have when it comes to institutions and politics, it's quite different and poles apart, and we can find lots of critiques into it. So do you think in case Gandhi was not a part of the national movement in the way he was, he would have been categorized more in terms of a spiritual leader itself and wholly, instead of in the realm of politics and nationalism and leader and everything? Because sometimes I cannot find them being in the same category. They're so different that I can't place them in the same category, and I feel that maybe his participation and his mobilization of the national movement might have made him get here.
So we just had a short seminar before we came in here by Professor from JNU, Rinku Lamba, who was talking about Ambedkar and Gandhi and how they were more alike than we think, especially if we take Ambedkar's thought right up to his almost last work, almost posthumous work, Buddha and his Dhamma. That Ambedkar was not so non-spiritual or interested, somehow secularist to the extent that he would not think about the place of religion in social life. So maybe the contrasts there are drawn too sharply. But your question was about Gandhi, and my sense about Gandhi here is that I just think that Gandhi operated along different categories of the political and social and the religious. I don't think that the way the question is posed is not the way he conceptualized his engagement. And I'll just say public engagement. Because for him, public engagement was always enmeshed in being political and social and cultural and mobilizing religious symbols and religious beliefs to the extent that he did. So for him, his idea of the public was completely different. So the idea that somehow, I don't know what you might categorize as Gandhi's spiritual leanings, that but whatever that might be, that somehow that doesn't have a political upshot is wrong. Because at least for Gandhi, even the mobilization of these languages have political consequences. And their political consequences he's deeply concerned about. So he's, at least in a modern sense, he's deeply political. So I wouldn't see him in any way as being somehow, really his major project is social, cultural or religious. I wouldn't see it like that at all.
I would just jump in to say, I appreciate your question, but maybe in Gandhi's vocabulary, the spiritual and the political divide is not present in that sharp a tone. The spiritual is political.
So basically, this is coming out from memory. I don't remember where exactly I read it or attended a seminar, where the idea was that Gandhi and Ambedkar, as we're seeing, is opposite. Were not real, they were actually complementary, where the theme of institutionalization is carried forward by both of them, one from above and the other from below. So what Ambedkar is trying to create institutions at top level, Gandhi is doing the exact same thing at the local level. So what are your thoughts on that?
I wouldn't. So the idea, I feel like sometimes there are patterns of thought that we lapse into that are easy and are convenient, but they're not true. So when we say something like complementary, almost like there's a neat little jigsaw puzzle, and if you put them all together, they make a wonderful collage. And I don't think that's quite the case, because these are all complicated historical figures who are they're contesting each other, they're collaborating with each other, they agree about some things, they deeply disagree about other things. So I would never mobilize the idea that they somehow come together neatly. So I won't try to do that. But I take your question to be, did Gandhi have an imagination about institutionalization from below? And I want to say two things. I don't want to be too. I'm not a Gandhi scholar, and I don't know that area of work deeply. But what I've seen, and I pay attention to institutions in Gandhi's work, is that I don't see that he was institutionally naive. You must remember that he was very effective at building a mass movement, and mass movements are not done just by writing letters. Though we know he was a remarkable correspondent, writing all the time, mass movements are not built just by writing letters. And clearly there is a sharp insight into what makes people move, and which he deploys repeatedly to generate that reworked idea of the Congress. He also shows a lot of political nous navigating the Congress party, right? So in its various sessions. So he's not institutionally naive. I hope I'm not coming across as saying that. It's one thing to be institutionally sharp and active, and another to have a grand institutional imagination. And that is not about, that is about trying to imagine institutional arrangements that don't exist. That you look out into the future and you say, we can build an institutional arrangement like this and it will work for these reasons. And my sense is that, I would quote Athri on this, is that he would resist that kind of modernist institutional imagination. He doesn't want to commit himself to those kinds of pictures. He would say that that's the wrong way of thinking about the problem. You can't think about institutions like this and design them and somehow hope they'll work in the future. So in that sense, I don't see them as being complementary. It's not like Gandhi had, his idea of the ashram as one of the key units of organization. Right? It's the institution of discipline, it's the institution of learning, and it's the institution of collective action. But just imagine, we're talking about the ashram as it's just. So I don't want to say more. I guess I'll close that by saying that for him, what mattered, the institutions that mattered, were not the kinds of institutions of not modern political institutions of the sort that we are concerned about, talk about and write about today. He had a completely different sense of where this might go.
I want to just know what Ambedkar thought about Uniform Civil Code, and why some political parties are so interested in that, and what may be the reasons minorities have a problem in that.
Okay. I hope I don't have to answer all three. I think it's fair that I should try and answer the first. It's also suitable for the occasion. The occasion is about Ambedkar and the 125th anniversary. So Ambedkar's view on the Uniform Civil Code is not one that is it's not dramatically etched out. He's not written a book on it. In other words, what evidence we can gather is that he had two instincts about the way laws should be designed. The first instinct was that the Hindu personal law had been designed and built around caste identity. It was, I mean, there's a long history of reform starting from 1832 onwards, but that caste identity and that Hindu religious beliefs have been encoded into personal law. And he was clear that if that remained, that would be detrimental to the backward classes and also to the building of a modern nation, because he had the imagination that we could build a new fraternal nation where we could all engage with each other, not based on our religious or other ascriptive identities. So, on the one hand, he was not in favor of religious-based laws. On the other, he understood that the collage, the collectives that made up India were complicated. He did not push. You remember the 1950s that the first target of reform was the Hindu law. And Ambedkar pushed that. It was not the reform of all personal law at that point in time. So he did understand that the nature of post-independent India needed some sensitivity to the question of religious laws, especially insofar as it applied to the minorities. And there is no evidence, even the discussions of, I hope I'm getting it right, Article 44 on the code. There's no evidence that he deeply opposed it or anything like that, or he thought that Uniform Civil Code must be applied on 1950, 26 January. That kind of evidence is not there. So that's the way I would answer it. I'd say it's an area where we don't have decisive evidence. It's the scanty evidence, but the evidence seems to be that he would prefer a model where everyone is governed by these kind of neutral secular laws, but he understands that in the context of post-independence India, that its application to political minorities is very complicated. And religious minorities is complicated.
Well, because there has not been much talk about communalism and partition, the two things that you picked up, so I go back to that. What I know about it is that Ambedkar emphasized a lot on ideology. For him, that occasional riot in which the minority, and mind you, he considered Dalits a minority. And there's an interesting episode. In 1944, Jinnah and Gandhi want to sort out their problems. So they are meeting. And Gandhi says, "Yaar, we Gujus can meet and keep talking whatever we want, but have you as a Muslim leaguer, the Muslim League, has it only raised the slogan of Pakistan, or have you worked in detail about what it would mean?" What is Jinnah's reply? He says, why should I have to write it? See, a few months after we raised the demand for partition, Ambedkar wrote a whole book, read it. That's my argument. So, and that is precisely because Ambedkar himself thought of himself as a minority. But he had a very sophisticated understanding of communalism. This is what I want to bring onto the table. For him, that occasional thing that happened with regard to practices, you nudging the Dalit out of the well, you not allowing the Dalit into the temple, etc., didn't bother him so much. He actually said it. He said that, my struggle with you, Gandhi, is not so much with the practices. My problem with you is with your ideals. So please keep in mind, because there was no talk about communalism, and hence I thought I'd just flag it.
I don't see the need for a response, but my sense on the communalism question is that he was clear that I don't want to talk about Jinnah, and I don't know that much about Jinnah. I read a little bit, not that much. But he was clear that Jinnah got the question of Pakistan wrong. He was absolutely clear about that. He wrote twice on the question, and there are two editions of the book on Pakistan. It's the second edition where his ideas are most clear, and he's absolutely clear that that there could be a defense of the idea of Pakistan, but Jinnah's defense of the idea of Pakistan is not what gets you there. So he's very careful about that. But Arun Shoury's book, sorry, to come back to the question of communalism, Arun Shoury's book has many axes to grind. One of his axes to grind is about how Ambedkar is anti-national. And Ambedkar is anti-national in at least 3 ways for Arun Shoury. Anti-national sounds familiar, right? We know what that's about. And he's anti-national because he makes common cause with Jinnah on the question of separate electorates. He makes common cause with the British on the question of the war. And there is this episode where he disavows the constitution. So Shoury stitches these 3 historical factors in a curious way, in Shoury's way. I don't to say that Ambedkar is anti-national. The way I would rephrase that point is, he gets the history wrong at various points, and I'm not going to make a detailed analysis of Shoury. But what's important is that his sense of him being anti-national is about a different imagination of the nation. And I think this is the important point when we think about Ambedkar. Because he actually has the intellectual resources and imagination to think of a different form of the nation. And this is what we fail to understand. We think that the mainstream view about our political legacy is that we have Nehru and we have Gandhi. But the person who has the most vivid, institutionally detailed imagination of the nation, which is quite different from the nation we have today, in that period is Ambedkar. And that's why we should, the moment of anti-nationalism is an invitation to study these different imaginations of the nation.